Hello everyone, you're listening to Sleeplis Whispers. Tonight we're taking you through the top 10 horror stories of 2025. 10 real, first-hand encounters that started in kitchen light and ended in shadows. These are reconstructed from eyewitness testimony, names and identifying details changed to protect those involved, and they range from shadow figures that don't belong to this world to voices calling from empty rooms. If you're new here, subscribe for nightly long-form scares and daily shorts. Turn off the lights, settle in, and remember, some doors open when you're not looking. Let's begin. I almost said no to the trip because my apartment had started to feel like neutral ground, just a place where time passed between bills, work, and sleep. But Rowan called late one evening and said he needed air, quiet, something with trees. He had found a cabin a few hours north, near a place locals called Briar Ridge. I agreed mostly because he sounded tired in a way jokes couldn't fix. Rowan has always been the organized one. Even as kids, he folded maps while I lost them. When I climbed into his truck before sunrise, he already had snacks lined up on the dashboard and coffee into identical thermoses. We drove as the city blurred into open road, then into nothing but hills and long stretches of pine. The signal died early. The radio fizzled into static. It felt like being slowly erased. The cabin sat off a thin dirt trail that barely deserved to be called a road. One room, one porch, and a fire pit that looked like it had been rebuilt too many times. Nothing fancy, but it was dry and solid. We unpacked just enough to pretend we'd stay a while, sleeping bags, a change of clothes, food in a cooler. Rowan cooked because he always cooked. Something about control settling his nerves. Potatoes in a pan, onions cut carefully, steak cooked along. For a while it worked. We laughed, played cheap card games, talked about people we hadn't thought about in years. The fire cracked. The dog waited politely behind the tree line. I remember thinking this was exactly what he needed. The first sound didn't scare me at first. It was just humming, soft and shapeless. No clear song. It drifted between the trees like someone thinking out loud. Rowan muted the music and tilted his head. "Wind can sound weird out here," he said, but he didn't sound confident. The humming stopped the moment the fire popped. Later, something hit the stones by the fire hard and sudden. A fist-sized rock rolled into the light and stopped by my boot. We both stood up. Rowan swore into the dark and yelled that we weren't interested in company. The forest swallowed his voice. A full minute passed before either of us sat again. We found a crushed water bottle near the edge of the clearing before we went inside. It hadn't been there earlier. We locked the cabin that night even though the locks were useless. Rowan took first watch with a flashlight and a folding chair on the porch. I fell asleep to the sound of insects and the low scrape of his chair shifting occasionally. I woke to pressure against my face light. Brief. Something had brushed the top of my sleeping bag. I thought it was Rowan waking me from my turn. "You good?" I whispered. The porch light flicked off. That's when I realized the zipper on the door was moving slowly, carefully. Whoever had opened it closed it again from the outside with the softest pull. I jumped up and swung the door open. The clearing was empty. My flashlight beam caught nothing but trees and the weak smoke from dying embers. Rowan was still asleep on the porch chair. We didn't argue about it. We just started paying attention. By morning, the chairs had been rearranged into a crooked half circle facing the fire pit. Neither of us had done that. A strip of red cloth hung from a branch beside the outhouse. Not tied, nailed, clean and exact. Nothing was stolen. That felt worse. Each night after that came with small changes. Footprints that didn't match either of our boots. Our cooler shifted a few inches. Stones stacked in neat little towers near the door. The humming returned more often, now always faint, never close enough to pinpoint. It felt directed, like someone testing distance. Rowan wanted to leave. I didn't. Not because I was brave, because fear makes me stubborn. I told him whoever it was just wanted to mess with us and would get bored if we didn't react. Saying it out loud didn't make it feel true. On the fourth night, I stayed awake alone after Rowan finally slept. The fire was almost out when I heard the zipper again. Slow, patient. I was already sitting up when the shadow leaned into the doorway. Not fully inside, just enough to block the dim coals. It stood there, not breathing loud, not shifting its weight, just present. I couldn't see a face, only the outline of a head and shoulders. Time dragged in pieces. When it finally withdrew, it didn't hurry. The zipper slid shut exactly the way it had been opened. I woke Rowan shaking so hard my teeth rattled. Inside the cabin, at the foot of my sleeping bag, Someone had placed a damp bundle of leaves shaped carefully like a pillow. The fire pit had been rearranged into a tight spiral. No footprints, no disturbed dirt. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch us while we slept. We packed before the sun rose. No talking, just hands moving fast. We walked, not ran, to the truck because panic makes noise. As soon as the tires hit pavement, Rowan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. Neither of us looked back. The city didn't fix it. Noise didn't fix it. Walls didn't fix it. I still feel watched in crowded places sometimes. Still double-locked doors that don't need it. Rowan doesn't camp anymore. Says he got his fill of the quiet. I don't know who stood outside our door. I don't even know if I want to. What stays with me isn't the shape of the shadow, it's the care, the patience, the way someone learned our routines without ever letting us see their face. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some distances exist for a reason. And some places don't want witnesses, only visitors. The end. I told myself I was driving out there for the silence. After probate forms, condolence calls, and the empty sound my apartment made once my parents were officially gone. The old family place above Cedar Bluff felt like unused air. My sister Leela came with me that first evening. She brought a cooler, a sack of groceries, and a battered deck of cards she'd carried since college because she said familiar objects kept panic in its lane. We didn't talk much while unloading. Grief turns conversations into tasks. The house still smelled faintly of pine cleaner and cold dust. Leila sliced apples at the counter, thin and neat. Dad would have complained these were too skinny. She said, smiling sideways, he would have eaten them anyway. I said, we burned the chicken. We laughed about it. We played one of his old country records on a turntable that wobbled before every song. For a while, the house felt like it had merely been paused. Not abandoned. The first strange thing happened the second afternoon. I was splitting kindling behind the shed when I heard humming slide through the trees. Not a song, just one drifting note, wandering without direction. It faded when I stopped working. Probably someone on the trail. Lila called from the porch. That night, snow fell, fresh and clean. By morning, a single line of footprints cut across the yard from the tree line to just beyond the porch. Lights reached and stopped. No return trail. One direction. We said nothing about it over coffee. That evening, something struck the side of the house. Hard. Lila jumped. I grabbed the flashlight and swept the yard. Nothing moved. On the porch, chair sat for stones stacked carefully by size. Smallest on top. That's not random, she said quietly after that. Small things stopped lining up right. The mailbox sat open when we hadn't checked it. The mudroom mat shifted overnight even though neither of us had touched it. A scarf we'd never seen hung from the fence one morning, frost still clinging to it. Once, I set a glass beside the sink before bed and found it upside down at dawn, dry and clean, like it had been washed. We started locking doors that had never needed locks. Leela left the hallway light on at night and kept the radio murmuring in the living room. Like a fake heartbeat for the house. It's probably someone from town, she said once. Some lonely creep with boundary issues. The tapping started after midnight. For soft taps on the back door. Even spacing. Then nothing. Sometimes it returned an hour later. Sometimes it waited until just before dawn. Never any rushing. Never any scratching. One afternoon we came back from the ridge and found the guest room unlocked. The bedspread lay folded back neatly as if someone had tested it for warmth. On the pillow rested a single blonde hair. Neither of us was blonde. That's when the house stopped feeling like property and started feeling like territory. We didn't call the police. There wasn't a crime you could point to, only rearranged normality. Instead, we sat at the dining table with kitchen knives laid beside our hands like ridiculous little promises. The dog lay beneath the table, ears pinned back, watching shadows like they owed him money. Around 2 in the morning, he growled. I crept to the front window. A sheep passed slowly along the edge of the porch light, just far enough back to stay half hidden. I opened the door a few inches and shouted, "Who's out there?" A man's voice answered immediately, calm and flat. "Checking the water lines. County work." "What's your name?" I demanded. Silence, then slow footsteps retreating into snow. The next day we packed with the intention of leaving, but intention moves slower than fear. Before sunset, we found a message etched faintly in frost on the truck windshield with a fingertip. "Stay a while." That night, the roof creaked. Not wind, not animals. Footsteps, heavy and spaced evenly from one end of the house to the other. Lila grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. The porch light flicked off. The tapping began again, faster now. We didn't shout. We didn't run. We waited until the steps stopped above us, gathered what we could carry, and slipped out the side door with the dog between us. We left the lights on. Mercy for a house that didn't deserve it anymore. We didn't look back when the truck door slammed. Years have passed. I still flinch when someone hums in a parking lot. Still triple check locks I already tested. Layla parks under lights only. We sit where we can see exits. Fear didn't make us wild, it made us methodical. I never saw his face. I don't know if he ever wanted more than proof that he could move through our lives. Without permission, what stayed with me wasn't terror, it was choreography. Someone learning our patterns, touching our quiet, rearranging our ordinary world just enough to let us know it could be entered. Sometimes, late at night, I hear for soft taps in my memory and have to remind myself I left that house. The end. I said I needed a week off before I'd actually convince myself I did. Meetings had blurred into each other at work. My shoulders lived permanently near my ears, and the company doctor used the word recharge like it was a prescription. So when my cousin Beck called, Old Pine Cabin this weekend, no signal, no nonsense, I booked a ride in under 5 minutes. Beck and I grew up with that cabin as an idea more than a place, a splintered dock, a crooked swing. Summers measured in mosquito bites and who could hold their breath the longest under the rowboat. He kept it after his divorce because it was cheaper than therapy and more honest than a year of talking about feelings. When we pulled up that Friday, the siding had gone the color of cheap ketchup and the porch sloped like it was trying to get away from the house. The lake was flat and hard under a gray sky. We unpacked in a silence that felt like a conversation to people moving through the same motion. With care, Beck carried in the cooler. I lugged the old deck of cards my aunt insisted on keeping, and we spread out like we were claiming a temporary kingdom. He lit the stove, and the cabin filled with the scent of coffee and the mechanical warmth of an old heater. We ate badly and loudly. I burned the pancakes and made the syrup taste like toast, and he pretended to apologize so hard it was funny. We drank beer outside until the air got sharp, then moved to the couch with a wool blanket and some of Dad's records stacked like relics. Near the turntable, for a few hours it was the ordinary balm I needed, jokes that circled back on themselves, the names of old dogs, the story where Beck jumped off the dock with a coat on and somehow survived around midnight. I woke because something hummed through the walls. It wasn't music, more like someone testing a note and then letting it hang. It slid through the woods, folded around the cabin, and then vanished. Beck shrugged when I mentioned it the next morning. Maybe someone on the far side, he said. People like to walk the ridge. I nodded because saying that made me feel watched sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. The first sign that someone had been closer than a passerby was small and absurd. We found a paper boat, one of those childish folds you make with scrap paper, on the steps leading to the dock, still dry though the morning had dew. It looked like a joke left for us to find. On the coffee table inside, exactly 3 matchsticks were arranged in a neat triangle, not knocked over, not scattered, placed dot after that. Normal things began to shuffle around as if a neat pair of hands had wandered through. A single glass of water we left on the counter the night before was upside down at dawn. The sugar jar sat a foot away from where we left it. The fly swatter leaned against the wall in a different corner. I found a little paper heart tucked under the TV remote, folded, creased, and blank. It wasn't ours. We started locking things that had never felt lock-worthy. Beck propped a chair under the doorknob like a joke that tried to be earnest. We kept the radio on a low hum in the living room, not for music, but for the illusion of other people. Each small move felt like an appropriate response to a problem that had no appropriate name. The next day we cut wood and stacked it with the impatience of men who wanted visible progress. While splitting logs, I noticed footprints pressed into the wet ground, near the shed to big for raccoon, to straight for deer. They stopped at the edge of the porch light circle and turned, as if whoever made them paused to study the house and then walked away. No return prints. That night, the hum returned and layered around a new sound, a slow, deliberate tap along the screen door in a rhythm like someone marking time to beats. Pause, one beat, pause like a private metronome. It repeated for minutes. Beck and I sat like the idiots with mugs in our hands and let it go on, because calling out felt like admitting something real. When a paper bag we left open landed face down on the hallway floor, as if somebody had closed it with a careful hand, the joke got small and mean. We checked every closet, every porch corner. Nothing out of place in a way that made sense. No footprints inside, no muddy sleeves. No evidence of entry beyond the things that had been shifted into patterns. On the third night, I woke because Beck touched my shoulder hard enough to make me breathe. He pointed toward the hallway. The bedroom door his was almost shut. A thin line of light bled under it, a slow rectangle that shouldn't have been there. We turned the lamp off before bed. We crept down on our bellies like thieves, like children sneaking past a parent. The room was exactly as he'd left it, only someone had made the bed differently. Corners tucked, blankets smooth, pillow fluffed as if someone had used it and then returned it to order. On top of the pillow sat three tiny objects aligned like a careful row: a splinter of birch, shaped like a tiny spoon, a cigarette filter with an X scored into its side, and a Polaroid half-burned at the corner. Its face stayed dark under the flash's chemistry, but the image was just suggestion, a blurred horizon and the faint angle of a shadow. It was intimate in a way that made my skin go cold. Not the intimacy of a threat with teeth. This felt like someone had entered our domestic life to catalog it, to annotate it with small, unreadable signatures. Who the hell does stuff like this? Beck whispered. We argued about calling the sheriff and then didn't. The conversation fell into practical stubbornness. What would we say? That a person had tittied up our bed and left us a cigarette, but like an offering? We both knew how it would sound the page for odd neighbors. That gets filed under no crime committed. Instead, we took turns sitting up and staring at the door until dawn like sentinels at a border. No one had asked permission to cross. The next day, we found something new. A strip of paper folded into an envelope tucked under the mat. Inside, in a blocky, careful hand, was a list of times: 2,310, 01 to 2, 03 for 5. No names, no words, just numbers, like someone cataloging visits. We left the back door propped open with the chair from the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, breath frosting in the beam of a flashlight, bags packed by the couch. When we stepped outside to go, the yard bore new signs. Across the lawn, someone had laid down a line of sticks, each cut to the same length and placed to form a narrow path that led from the tree line to the corner of the dock. At the end of the path, someone had stood a single, bright thing above the water, an old-school compass nailed to a post, its needle spinning lazy circles. No truck tracks. I asked. Nothing, Beck said, and when I looked at him, his face had that same hollow tiredness that comes from someone who's lost patience with the world being inexplicable. We drove away with the truck's heater on full and the radio thudding loud across the seats. My phone buzzed as the signal returned with fragmentary messages, ads, a missed call from my boss, a meme Beck's girlfriend had sent. Then an unknown number popped up with a plain text: nice place, need to be invited, and no punctuation, no signature. The timestamp matched the middle of the night when the list of numbers had started. We never found out who walked through our rooms and left paper ships and matchstick triangles. We told a handful of people in the days after, friends who laughed nervously, my aunt who asked if we'd been drinking, but you could tell the sentences were being measured and softened for an audience that wanted tidy stories. What lingered wasn't fear of an intruder with a face. It was the way someone had used small, domestic actions: folding a paper heart, smoothing a blanket, arranging bits of trash into patterns to demonstrate control without confrontation. The point wasn't to steal or to hurt. It was to mark presence, like a margin note in a book you thought you owned. Months later, I still find myself checking that the bedroom lamp is off twice before I go to sleep. If a stranger hums in the hallway outside my building, I stop breathing until it moves on. Once, in a grocery store, I bent to pick up an orange that had rolled under a rack and found a little triangle of paper tucked beneath it. I straightened and walked away with the peel of the orange in my hand and the feeling of someone cataloging my movements stuck like lint. The cabin sits on the lake in my memory like a place that taught me how fragile the border is between ordinary and observed. The lesson wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a shattered door or a villain's confession. It came in tiny, deliberate gestures that said, quietly and very clearly, someone could be inside the quiet, and you wouldn't necessarily know until they wanted you to. The end. I told myself I needed the weekend because my apartment had started to feel like a waiting room. Emails bled into sleep, and phone alerts kept my head keyed on a low pulse. When Mara texted, "Weekender at Hollow Pine, you in?" I said yes before I could argue with the voice that sounded suspiciously practical. My own. Hollow Pine was the kind of place you only ever remember in fragments until you stand in the clearing. And the memory slides back into shape. A narrow lane through scrub birch, a mailbox crooked as if someone had leaned on it for a story. and a squat cabin with paint peeled away in strips so that it would look like sunburned skin. Mara had reservations in her tone when we pulled up an economy of anxiety. She'd kept the cabin since her grandmother died. It was cheaper than therapy and quieter than a human. Inside smelled like old cedar and lemon oil. Mara unpacked with the same ritualism she applied to everything. 1 thermos per person. Coffee grinds packed in a mason jar. 2 mugs stowed in the cupboard. She put on the radio and turned it down until it was more texture than sound. We hadn't planned the trip as an escape from anything more than noise. But grief and work and small disappointments have a way of collecting at your ribs. For the first night we lit a fire and let the dark feel like a friendly heavy blanket. We drank cheap wine, told versions of stories that made us sound better than we were, and laughed in the safe, small bursts people make when they believe someone else will carry the weight if the laugh fails. The oddness started like a joke. I woke on the sagging couch with my cheek warm from the blanket, and the cigarette ash from last night gone from the little tin ashtray. I assumed Mara had cleaned up when I stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee. She was in the bathroom rinsing the thermos, humming a song I didn't recognize. I thanked her and went back to the couch. Later, while we stacked the last of the logs for the evening, I found a single pale feather tucked into the crook of a porch railing, careful placement, like someone had left a bookmark. It wasn't ruffled or trampled. It sat as though waiting for me to notice, and when I did it felt rude, like someone had rearranged the room to make me the subject of a punchline. That's weird, I said. Mara shrugged as if to hand the scene back to the world where inconveniences live. Neighbors, she offered. Kids passing through? We left it at that, though both of us kept glancing at the tree line as if someone could be standing at the edge of our vision. The pines leaning close. Their trunks looked like a congregation. The first real intrusion was small enough to be embarrassing. A paperback mystery I left open on the coffee table was closed, face down. The corner dog-eared a page marked where someone might have paused and then left. The mug I'd set on the sofa earlier was now on the center of the table, turned upside down. No fingerprints, no evidence of hasty hands. It felt less like theft and more like provenance. Someone had curated our evening. That night we stayed up later than usual. The radio wound down to a low, domestic static. We talked about everything and nothing old lovers. The time Mara's car slid into a shallow ditch and the man who helped her refused a thank you until she bought him coffee. We fell into a comfortable boredom. Sleep felt like an indulgence we deserved. At around to a .m. A soft, measured tapping began at the back door. Not frantic or erratic, but steady 3 taps, pause to taps. Pause like someone playing with a private rhythm. The dog, who had been asleep by the hearth, lifted his head and snuffled, then dropped it like he decided whatever was outside wasn't worth his hearing. Mara sat up. Probably raccoons, she muttered. I wanted to agree and feel childish. I didn't. We left the light on and the radio ticking while we tried to sleep. The tapping stopped as if it had an appointment elsewhere. When the morning came, the footprints in the dew arched across the yard and stopped at the stone birdbath, as if someone had peered over it and decided to turn back. The prints were too large for Fox and too neat for a drunk. Small things accreted into pattern. A handful of pine needles laid arranged on the front step, parallel, as though someone had been practicing order. A drawer in the kitchen that I could swear Mara had locked was slightly ajar, with a spoon placed across the top like a bar. Once one full night, when the moon was a thin coin, we returned from an errand. To find the kitchen chairs turned to face the window, symmetrical, as if the room were set up for an audience. By the second evening, our jokes had gone quiet. We sat with a flashlight between us like the people sharing a fragile truce. Mara started making lists: lantern, extra batteries, chains for the truck, practical things that read like attempts to translate fear into logistics. I stopped making light of it. The humor felt dishonest now. The voice came on the third night. We were in the main room, the fire beginning to slump to ember, when a knock came at the front door. 3 measured raps. Not hurried, not desperate, just polite enough to sound ordinary. Mara swung the door wide, peering out into the night. The porch was empty, the lane a black ribbon unfurling into trees. Hello? She called softly. A voice answered from the darkness, male, close enough that the porch light illuminated the breath hanging in the air. Evening. My truck stuck back by the trailhead. Thought I'd ask if you had a rope. Cold out here. Mara kept the door only cracked. Sorry, we've got nothing here. We're heading in for the night. The voice paused. When it came again, it sounded flat, practiced. Mind if I warm up for a minute? It's good to be around people. The ask would have been manageable if Mara had a younger brother or if she were a woman within. Easy trust. She's neither. No, she said. We're turning in. Her hand tightened on the door jamb. We both heard the man breathe and the faint rustle of fabric as he moved away. For a moment the night swallowed him whole. 3 nights later, Mara woke me. Her whisper sliced straight through sleep. There's someone in the guest room. She moved like someone slow to panic, methodical, precise. The guest room had been closed when we went to bed. The lamp over the nightstand, a small brass thing we'd switched off, glowed with a weak yellow that shouldn't have been on. The blanket was tucked with a care that suggested Hints had just smoothed it. On the pillow lay 3 objects in a neat row: a tiny coal, a silver thumbtack, and a coin with the edge rubbed smooth. My hands went numb. It felt obscene, the intimacy of a used bed that hadn't been slept in by any of us. Mara walked forward and ran her palm over the blanket. Warm. Not room temperature warm, but the kind of residual heat left when something has only recently departed. Who does this? She whispered. We called the ranger. They came out in the gray of mid-morning with a half-awake shrug, a clipboard, and the tired patience of someone who fields too many odd calls. There aren't any campsites nearby, the ranger said, but folks walk the ridge. Maybe some local with a thing for arrangements. We tried to have the word creep sound small and uncommitted, but it ballooned between us. The ranger took a formal report and offered the phone number for non-emergency calls. They left with the soft authority of someone who knows the woods are messy and humans weirder. That afternoon, as we packed to leave early, Mara found a folded scrap of paper tucked into the jamb of the back door. The ink was blocky and even. It read, "I watch how people leave." It was not a threat so much as a log entry, an annotation that could be read with no malice, and the same message: someone had been watching. Studying departure. We did not wait for night. We loaded the truck with practiced haste, hands that had turned travel into ritual. A duffel, 2 mugs, the record player packed carefully in its box. On the porch, we left the light on like a small mercy. As we drove away, the cabin receded into a square of dark, and on the passenger seat my lungs failed to find a steady rhythm for a long time. Back in the city, the afterlife of that weekend arrived in small habits. I stopped leaving the hallway light off. Mara leaves the kettle boiling no matter the hour. We both have the sudden, irrational urge to check beds twice before we sleep. A 4-note whistle tune will make my stomach drop. A neat stack of anything rocks, napkins, coasters will set my hands to rearranging it, because the idea of someone else dictating order to my environment is intolerable. I called the ranger once, months later, to ask if anyone else had reported similar arrangements. We get folks who like to leave little things, he said. Sometimes it's art, sometimes it's someone marking a path. Hard to know what they mean. His voice had the same patient diction as before, the voice of someone who holds too many private puzzles. We never saw the man again. Maybe he was a hermit, a bored teenager, a person with a need to catalog. The thing that inhabits me is not his face, but the tiny quiet minutes when he chose what to move. And when, the cruelty of it lay not in violence, but in intimacy, the way private spaces were edited without consent until the house felt like a book, with someone else's notes in the margins. Sometimes, when the apartment is too loud and the bus is late and my phone buzzes too much, I imagine I could go back. I know, now, the calculation I make at the threshold: is quiet worth the possibility of being rearranged? For a long time after Hollow Pine, the answer was no. The end. I said yes because the noise in my head had started to sound like static email pings, overdue notices, my manager breathing down the calendar. When my brother Reed texted, "Weekend at Maplemere? No bars, no responsibilities," I hit reply before my brain could talk me out of it. Maplemere was a squat thing of weathered cedar tucked at the end of a grassy lane, where the county road thinned into a track and the pines closed ranks. We'd spent summers there as kids, canoes that leaked, a rope swing that threatened to throw you into the reeds, a dock that smelled like fish and sunscreen. Reed had kept the place after Dad started traveling for work and never quite came back for weekends. He said it needed one last tidy before the auction. I said I'd help. What I didn't say was that I needed a place where my phone wouldn't find me. The cabin smelled like old varnish and lemon oil when we arrived. Reed was already inside, sleeves rolled, a box of mismatched mugs on the counter. "You look thin," he said, which his brother speak for "Are you okay? You sound like you did 5 conference calls in a row," I said. He laughed, a short thing that made his eyes go soft. We unpacked in companionable silence to duffels, a cooler, The same deck of cards we'd chipped the corners off as kids. The first night was the sort where the world seems to shrink to the size of a coffee cup. We built a small fire, boiled beans until we called them rustic, and traded stories that were half jokes and half confession. The lake held its breath, and the sky spread such sharp stars it was like someone had scraped a window clean. Somewhere across the water a bird called long, whooping, and then, not long after, a second call that answered it but finished early, as if whoever called had forgotten the last note. Echo, Reed said. Well, he didn't sound convinced. On morning we did the sensible work of cleaning. Cabinets, curtains, a cupboard with a colony of forgotten spices. We found old Polaroids inside a tackle box sunburned faces. A crooked fist then taped one to the inside of the cupboard door, so it would look like the place knew it belonged. That afternoon I found a small, folded square of paper on the porch step, for tiny circles had been punched out of it, like a stupid confetti pattern. I unfolded it and found nothing written inside. Kids, Reed said, glancing toward the lane. Or raccoons. That night, when the porch light flicked on and the radio dwindled to a low hum, something hit the screen door soft, deliberate, almost ceremonial. A single knot of sound. We froze, both of us, like people who had just been assigned new roles in an old play. Probably somebody lost, Reed said, voice steady. Trail walkers sometimes get turned around. We left the door locked and leaned our chairs back, watching the glow from the fire feather into the trees. The sound returned later, 3 measured taps this time, with long pauses between them. It wasn't frantic. It was patient, like somebody with time on their hands. When the tapping stopped, we both exhaled without meaning to. Small things began to rearrange themselves around the edges of our days. A single mitten hung on the fence post where we'd left none. A pebble was placed perfectly at the center of the dock's top plank. The matches were crossed on the kitchen table in an X. None of it was violent. None of it was meant to frighten in an obvious way. It felt like an editor was going through our rooms, smoothing margins and leaving notes. You think someone's messing with us? I asked at midnight as we pushed cards across the table. Maybe a bored neighbor, Reed said. He had the kind of practical explanations that are honestly comforting until they aren't. On the second night I took first watch. I told myself it was because Reed left me the lantern, but really it was because the idea of some anonymous spectator learning our patterns made my skin crawl. I sat with the lantern low, eyes catching the dark for shapes, and halfway through a dumb podcast about seafood I didn't want to hear, I saw movement by the boathouse, a silhouette leaning over the rowboat as if testing balance. I stood, intending to call out, and turned when a figure slid up the path instead, man-sized, hoodie up, hands wrapped around something small so it wasn't obvious. He stopped under the porch light and raised his head enough that the light caught one side of his face. Not a mask, not a horror movie stranger, just a man whose jaw looked like a carpenter's. Face unremarkable in a way that makes you notice it more. Evening, he said, voice flat and careful, like someone reading lines off paper. My truck's stuck by the old oak. You got a rope. Phone's dead. It was the most reasonable request a stranger could make at midnight, which made it feel wrong. Reed opened the door a crack, kept his hand on the frame. We don't have a winch, Reed said. We're heading in. The man's shoulders relaxed by the centimeter. Thought I'd ask. It's colder than I figured. He didn't try to push past the light. He didn't sound drunk or frantic, just practiced. You got a name? I asked, because my tongue wanted to be busy. Cal, he said. No need to fuss. He turned and walked away without another word. We watched his silhouette stitch into the trees until it blurred and vanished. For the rest of the night neither of us slept properly, listening for the rustle of leaves that meant a person was moving through the margins of our world. In the morning a Polaroid lay on the welcome mat, one of those cheap instant prints, corners curling. On it, someone had taken a photograph of the masonry of the dock, the planks, the water, the sky. It was blurred in a way that made the horizon look like a smear of graphite. Someone had written a single word on the white border in block letters, seen. Reed and I stared at it like it was an accusation. We thought about calling the ranger. We thought about calling the sheriff. Neither call seemed to promise anything. We wanted police reports and polite officers, and the inevitable shrug that a lot of things are possible in an empty patch of woods. Instead we set up absurd defenses, a folding chair under the knob, a kitchen knife within arm's reach. The old boat oars leaned like spears against the shed. Whatever patience had gone into those small intrusions turned sharper. The next day, we found the blanket on Reed's couch folded into thirds and a white sock placed on top, like a punctuation mark. A nail hammered into the back porch rail held a tiny, neatly knotted bundle of twine. Inside the twine someone had tucked a scrap of cloth with a child's floral pattern. It smelled faintly of mothballs and something else I couldn't name. We stopped joking about it then. On night 3, the joke bled past fright. I woke to Reed shaking my shoulder. "Get up," he whispered. There was no need for volume. I slid out of the sleeping bag and followed him to the doorway. The main room was dim. The fire was coals. Someone had turned on the lamp by the bookshelf, and in its light the room looked like a portrait. Everything was in small order. No overturned mugs, no mud tracked in. Just the lamp, and on the coffee table, 3 items set in a row: a coin, a bottle cap, and a grain of wood carved into the shape of a small boat. The air tasted colder than it should have. Reed crept forward. "Did you do this?" He mouthed. "No." I mouthed back. We moved like burglars, quiet and precise, and checked every door, every closet. No sign of a forced entry, no footprints in the carpet. It was like a ghost had been patient enough to become tidy and left an offering as proof. It had been there. We left before dawn, not because we were cowards, my pockets still weighted with keys and guilt, but because silence, when it had someone paying attention, stopped feeling like a mercy. We packed with a speed that felt holy and drove away while the lane hummed under the tires. Back in town, the world reassembled into the ordinary shapes, lights, traffic, faces that belonged to other people's lives. But it took days before the little rituals loosened from my body. I double-checked the locks in hotel rooms. I left the porch light on when I drove away from my apartment. When a person hummed on the street, I felt the old prickle in my neck. Weeks later, I got in the mail from an unknown address with one line in the subject: "Thank you for looking." No name, no explanation. I deleted it because deleting felt like an action. Sometimes, in the quiet where the city forgets to be loud, I could still pull a memory out like a splinter, standing on the porch with my hands empty. A man in a hoodie saying a normal thing in a normal voice, and the world sliding by his bones so he could learn how we sleep and where we keep our phones. The worst part was not that he could have broken and he could have been a criminal, a conspiracy, or a bored neighbor, but that he'd chosen not to. He'd shown us the shape of access and then left it ornamented, like a margin note I never asked for. I tell the story now like a small confession, like a thing that happened to people who are careful and unlucky. People nod, say something consoling, and move on. But late at night, when a truck idles past my windows or someone hums a tune with the wrong last note, I find my hands going to the lamp switch, tucking my blanket, counting the spaces between the boards of the floor, measuring the difference between ordinary freedom and the private, studied kind of danger that never raises its voice. The end. I was 23 when my job transferred me 3 states away with barely 2 weeks' notice. The raise wasn't great, but the experience mattered, and I told myself I'd survive on ramen if I had to. What I didn't have time for was finding a decent place to live on short notice. Studios near the office cost more than my paycheck could handle, so I did what everyone does now. I posted everywhere: Facebook groups, rental sites, subreddits. Within a day, a man named Evan messaged me saying he had a room available in his house for cheap. I clicked his profile like a detective. Normal pictures, no obvious red flags, gym selfies, a dog, a few generic vacation shots. We facied him that night. He gave me a full virtual tour of the house: to bedrooms, 1 bath, small kitchen, quiet street. He claimed he owned it outright. The price was almost suspiciously affordable, but my savings were terrifyingly low. He didn't flirt, didn't act strange, just quiet and polite. Against my parents' advice, I said yes. A week later, I pulled into the driveway with my car stuffed to the ceiling. Evan was already outside waiting. The first thing I noticed was how close our eye level was. I'd expected him to be taller, based on his pictures. He helped me bring my bags in without saying much. My bedroom was already furnished with a bed and dresser. He said his old roommate had moved suddenly. That first night was normal, too normal. We barely spoke. The next day, Sunday, he insisted on showing me around town. I figured it was a roommate courtesy thing. He showed me grocery stores, malls, coffee places. And on the drive back, he suggested we grab lunch together. "I'm not really hungry," I said. He immediately pivoted. "Then drinks. Just one." I declined again. Nicely. He pushed again. I declined again. His mood flipped so fast it gave me whiplash. He went dead quiet. The rest of the drive uncomfortable, intense. That was the first moment I felt that tight warning in my chest. Monday through Thursday blurred together with work stress and exhaustion. It wasn't until Thursday night that something felt wrong. I dumped my laundry onto my bed and realized the pile looked different, smaller. When I loaded the washing machine, I noticed one of my bras was missing. I searched my room 3 times, drawers, closet, bathroom, nothing. A horrible thought crossed my mind, and I hated myself for even thinking it. That same night, I ordered a locking doorknob online. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. When it arrived that weekend, I installed it while Evan was out. It took 15 minutes. I planned to explain later. That night at 1:18 a.m., someone slammed their fist against my bedroom door. "Why is this locked?" Evan shouted. I didn't respond. I lay in bed, frozen, barely breathing. In the morning, my phone was full of texts. "Why is there a new lock? Take it off. We need to top the door. Gets unlocked today." My hands were shaking as I tapped back, explaining that I was a woman living with a stranger and needed privacy. He replied calmer, but the answer was still no. He demanded the old doorknob go back on, and the terrifying part, he had only known I changed it because he tried to open my door while I was asleep. I switched it back. I returned the lock. I didn't sleep that night. 3 days later, a girl knocked on the front door while Evan was gone. She looked about my age, nervous, alert. "You live here?" she asked. When I nodded, her face tightened. "You need to leave now." She told me Evan had multiple restraining orders, that he stalked women, that she was one of them. She said she saw me moving in and waited for the right moment to warn me. Before she left, she said, "He always chooses girls who are new to town." I started packing immediately. I lied to Evan, telling him I was leaving because of a sudden family emergency. At first, he seemed cooperative, promised to return my deposit the next day. That night, I woke up because my mattress dipped. There was someone sitting on my bed, a shape in the dark. My brain hadn't caught up yet when his hand covered my mouth. "Don't scream," Evan whispered. "Someone lied to you about me." I froze. His other hand slid slowly up my leg. My whole body went cold. I kicked, rolled, and bolted for the door. He shouted after me. I ran outside barefoot and called the police from behind a neighbor's hedge. When they arrived, he denied everything. Of course he did, but they stayed while I packed. When one officer pulled me aside, he said quietly, "We've dealt with him before." I left with everything I owned stuffed into trash bags and drove straight to a hotel. I moved into a studio apartment the very next morning. I never lived with a male roommate again, not because all men are dangerous, but because once is enough to teach your nervous system what danger feels like. The end. I said yes to staying home because I thought I could squeeze in one more match. Before my parents left town, they were gone for the weekend helping an aunt. Something about a car breakdown that turned into a 2-day favor. And for once I had the house to myself. No curfew, no lights out, just the cheap glow of my monitor and the late night silence. That makes everything else softer. That night I was deep in a ranked match of a strategy game I'd been grinding for months. My hands knew the hotkeys better than I knew my own locker combination. I was the kind of kid who could read a minimap while chewing a sandwich. The house was quiet in the way it gets when everyone's just off doing slightly more important things. Washer in the basement, dishwasher finished and buzzed away, a car idling at the curb in the distance. I told myself I'd stop after this match. It lasted longer. The doorbell pressed twice. I didn't like interruptions mid-game, but I told myself to be polite. I unmuted, waited for a natural pause and troop movement, then called out, "Who is it?" A woman's voice answered, frail, with a softness at the edges. "Hello, dear. May I use your phone?" I considered the obvious rules my parents had drilled into me. No strangers, no matter how small the request, and cracked the door an inch, keeping the storm door latched. She stood on the porch bundled in a thin coat despite the warm night, smile easy, one hand tucked behind her back. Her hair was the smoky white of someone who'd had 1,000 winters. "I'm sorry," I said. "My parents aren't home. The library down the street probably has a phone." Her smile didn't change. "That's very thoughtful, young man," she said, and then, almost conspiratorially, "But I have trouble walking that far. There are ways to say no and keep the world soft." I said the library again, said I hoped she'd find somewhere, and closed the door. Her face didn't fall. Her smile remained fixed and patient, and that's the part that slid under my skin. back at my desk. My fingers hovered over keys that suddenly felt dumb and useless. The house was quieter than before, as if the porch had taken something with it when it left. I told myself to laugh it off and went back to the match, but my plan dissolved after a few minutes when a metallic clink sounded against the window next to my desk. It could have been a branch tapping, an old house settling. It wasn't either. The sound repeated, metallic against glass, like someone's fingernails running along a spoon. I muted the game and froze. The kind of silence that makes the blood in your ears louder than normal. I walked over, lowered the blinds an inch, and peered out. The porch light haloed the front yard. Nothing. The concrete step, the mailbox, the way the hedges cut off the world. I told myself again it must be the old lady. Maybe she'd wandered round the side and was checking windows to see who was home. That was kinder to think. The doorbell rang again, lower and more insistent this time. I didn't answer. I sat on the floor with my back against the desk, breathing in the plastic smell of my headset, counting down until my palms didn't feel like small animals. The ringing stopped, the clinking at the window still. Eventually, after a long while, I told myself I was a coward and turned off the monitor and tried to sleep. At some point in the dark, I heard footsteps on the porch. Not the shuffle of the old woman from earlier. These were younger, heavier, the kind of stride that doesn't hesitate. When I cracked the bedroom door open, I saw someone standing in the halo of the front light. He looked maybe 10 or 15 years older than the woman, all dirt on his work boots and a baseball cap pulled tight. "Hey," he said. "My mom wandered off. She has dementia. You've seen her. Relief does strange things to people." I told him where the woman had been, pointed vaguely back toward the sidewalk. He thanked me in the kind of mechanical way distracted people do, then got close to the door and asked, "Mind if I come in for a minute? My phone died and I need to get her info down. It's cold." The instinct to help was louder than the voice telling me not to open the door. I told him I could look around the yard, that maybe she'd gone to the side. He nodded and walked the house slowly, peering into the hedges, patting the trunk of the old maple like someone who knows the woods by touch. He moved down the flank of the house and out of sight. I waited at the back window expecting to see him out there searching. I saw nothing. No cap turning, no jacket, not even a shadow. The backyard was empty and quiet, the grass wet with dew. The man had simply vanished like he'd fallen into the ground. When I went inside, my stomach felt hollow. I tried to call out to the front, asked if he'd seen anyone, but the house answered with the sound of the refrigerator humming. I told myself he'd been someone from the neighborhood, that he'd gone down the block to call a relative. The idea that he might have been in my yard and then left without speaking to me nagged at the edges of my mind like a burr. The night refused to be normal. Sometime near midnight, I woke to a tapping on the outside of my bedroom window, slow and deliberate. Not a branch, not a knuckle on glass. It sounded like someone tapping the flat side of a knife. My throat closed when I rose and was met by the image of a pale face of breath from the pane, and a metal glint in the hand at its side. She was inches away, the older woman at the window. The smile was bolder now. She held a kitchen knife on the sill, the blade flashing small bright as if she polished it for the occasion. I backed away the way you back away from something alive with intent. The ringing started again at the front door, frantic and sharp. The woman at the window tapped the blade once, as if punctuation was needed, then turned her head the tiniest degree to watch me. Her eyes were not cloudy the way dementia steals light. They were bright as river stones. I did the only thing that felt like it might keep me safe. I stayed absolutely still. I let the house be small and the world outside be dangerous and waited for something to happen that I could put a name on. The doorbell stopped. The tapping stopped. The night remained obscene in its silence until, finally, morning smeared through the curtains like white paint. I didn't sleep properly. I didn't breathe comfortably. The house was the same, but the seams had been rattled. When my parents returned, I told them what happened. My father listened with a jaw that wanted to spasm and then tried to be reasonable. My mother hugged me and kept her voice calm because it was what she does. They called the non-emergency police line and described the woman and the man. Officers came, took notes, and asked questions in the way officers do, their faces polite, but their eyes tired. "We'll patrol the neighborhood," one of them said. "See if this pattern repeats." They found nothing definitive. No footprints in the yard beyond the ones I made in the dew when I'd opened the back gate that night. The hedges gave up nothing. They asked if I could identify the man or the woman. I had nothing but the quick grain of recognition, the woman's too wide smile, the cap, the way the man's boots looked like they'd been kicked in a ditch recently. In the weeks that followed, I learned how to carry that night like a small stone in my pocket. I kept the porch light on until dawn. I left the television tuned to some sleepy channel that would make a human sound in the room. I stopped sleeping with the bedroom window open even in summer. Whenever a stranger asked for directions or for a favor, I learned to ask for proof. When someone knocks late, I stand at the door with the chain on and watch the space between the lamp and the sidewalk, as if a second's betrayal could be spotted there. I still don't know if the woman and the man were working together, if he'd been checking whether I was alone before the woman came around the side, or if she was simply cruel with the timing of her presence. I don't have an answer to why he walked away from my house, and why she tapped steel against my window like she'd been practicing the alphabet of fear. The thing that settles in my throat is the understanding that the world can be ordinary and small and then, in a breath, be rearranged by two people who knew the contours well enough to move through them, without leaving more than a whisper behind. Some nights, when the house is very still and my mind lets the memories rise like bubbles, I hear a faint metallic tap in the dark and my hands go to the light switch like a reflex. The match I missed that night doesn't matter anymore. The thing that matters is that I answered the door with my eyes open, and I kept my distance when the script started to feel rehearsed. That's not bravery, exactly, just a small, practical luck, and a rule I still follow. If someone at your door makes you want to move, you move. The end. I remember the last day of 4th grade like a movie with the wrong soundtrack. Everything cheerful on the surface, undercut by a feeling I couldn't name until it was too late. The school smelled like disinfectant and crayons, and everyone was fidgeting with backpacks and trading promissory notes about summer plans. My mom always picked me up the final afternoon. She said it was tradition, and my best friend Noah and I had planned to crash his house afterward for pizza and video games. When the bell rang, we funneled out in our classroom line and waited at the front doors with Mrs. Carter. Parents crowded the sidewalk in little knots of cheer. I was craning my neck, trying to spot my mom's blue jacket, when a man waved at me from between the cars. He moved too quickly, like he'd rehearsed the wave. "Ethan," he called, lifting his hand. He smiled the smile grown-ups use when they assume they're doing a kindness. He told me he was Noah's uncle and that my mom had called and asked him to pick me up because she was stuck. I told Mrs. Carter, and she glanced over at him, and he made a show of answering her before offering his arm. He talked fast-breathy, eager, and my backpack felt heavier as he tugged me along. When he led me to his car, a dark station wagon that smelled faintly of old fast food, I should have asked more questions. Instead, my head was full of the sleepover plan. It didn't take long for the ride to feel wrong. We turned away from the short route toward my neighborhood and onto a strip of streets I didn't recognize. He kept filling the silence with chatter. What grade I liked best, whether I played soccer, what teachers were funny. I looked down at my hands and felt like I was in a tiny bubble, separate from the road outside. After a while, we pulled up at a house with the porch light off, curtains drawn tight. From the outside, it looked ordinary, but the way he shut the car door and locked it made my stomach go cold. He took me inside and flipped the deadbolt behind him. So automatically I thought maybe this was how they always lived. "Go wait in the living room, kiddo," he said, as if we'd agreed on this before. Noah's downstairs. He's playing Go On. I'll be right back. When the screen door clicked and his footsteps padded away, my feet stopped moving. The room was dim and smelled like stale air. A lamp in the corner cast more shadow than light. I walked to the front door and pulled. It wouldn't budge. The lock had a keyhole, and even with all my strength, the knob stayed stubborn under my palm. Panic had a way of making your mouth dry and your brain run loops. I noticed the phone on the wall by the kitchen, an old landline with a curly cord. I grabbed it because grabbing felt like doing something useful. My voice trembled as I whispered the address into the ear of the operator, who answered, "Yes, ma'am." "Where are you?" she asked clearly, professionally, the kind of voice that tells you someone heard you. "My name is Ethan. I read the house number off the mailbox like I'd practiced it in my mind. "I'm at a house near Willow Lane. I didn't mean to come here." He said Noah was downstairs, but I don't think that's right. She stayed on the line and told me she was sending officers right away. She told me to hide, to make sure the door was closed, to whisper if somebody came in. Her calm voice was a rope I could clutch. I pushed the receiver under a dish towel and crept back to the living room. The man's footsteps returned to the hall. He called my name in the same syrupy tone he'd used outside. My knees felt like rubber. He came in and asked in a lighter voice if I wanted a snack. My voice shook when I said I wanted to call my mom first. His smile vanished. The hand that grabbed my wrist was quick and hard. He yanked me toward the basement door like I was a backpack. In the brief scuffle, the phone skittered off the counter and clacked under the towel on the kitchen. I had no idea if the operator could still hear my heartbeat through the line, but she could. The dispatcher had said officers were en route. Halfway down the concrete steps, the basement had slammed behind us and a bulb clicked. The bulb hanging from the ceiling threw a thin disc of light over cracked concrete. For a while, he paced upstairs like someone who had errands and could take his time. I curled around a support beam and tried to make myself small. Then the house filled with noise. 3 sharp rings at the front door. A hard knock that sounded like authority. Someone shouted, "Police, open up." The man cursed and the bolt rattled. In that moment, I ran for the steps and screamed as loud as I could. A hand caught me and a uniformed officer hauled me into his arms and up through the door. As if I were nothing and everything at once. Outside, there were patrol cars with lights trembling their way across the lawn. My mom arrived minutes later like a comet, wet-faced and crying, and somebody wrapped her around me like a life preserver. The man didn't get far. He was arrested in the driveway, bewildered as if someone had finally turned on a harsh light. Later, the police told my parents the man had worked with Noah's father at a plant and knew their routine. He'd seen an opening and tried to use it. I learned later that the dispatcher had kept the line open and that nearby officers had been able to race because the call was clear and urgent. If I hadn't grabbed that phone and whispered my fear into someone trained to act, I have no doubt the ending would be darker. Years pass and some pieces fade. The sound of the sirens is still a burn in my memory. But what stays is this, the sharp, practical knowledge that when the world tilts, a single whispered call could be the hinge that swings everything back, the end. New Year's Eve felt like a dare that year. Everyone we knew wanted to exhale 2020 and pretend the calendar could sweep it clean. My friend Zane offered his parents' house for the night. They were out of town and said I could crash there, which meant a free place to celebrate and a guaranteed couch to pass out on. The party was loud and sloppy in the best way, strings of fairy lights, red solo cups, people crammed into every corner. At midnight, we all shouted over music, hugged, and toasted like the next year would fix things. After that, groups peeled off, taxis, other invites, people who had places to be. By around 3 a.m., it was just a handful of us who'd fallen asleep on couches or refused to leave, me, Zane, and Marco, who'd nodded off halfway through a movie. The house settled into that late-night hush, the kind that makes small noises feel enormous. At first, we ignored a faint noise, a single thin creak now and then, like the whole house was remembering its joints. Old houses do that, we told each other. Pipes, settling lumber, the wind. But the sound kept returning, patient and measured. Creak, pause, creak. Zane lifted his beer and went quiet. Marco mumbled and kept his eyes closed. The noise seemed to come from beneath our feet, the basement, and the hair along my arms prickled in a way that cheap beer couldn't fix. Probably the furnace, I said. Even as my voice sounded small, Zane didn't buy it. He walked to the hallway and cracked open the stair door, calling down, "Hello? Anyone down there?" The answer was only the faint echo of the creak, and then silence so whole it pressed into our chests. We looked at each other and did the bravest thing we could think of. We armed ourselves with kitchen knives and went down. The basement smelled like old cardboard and nothing cleaned in decades. A couch sagged against the far wall, an ancient TV leaned against a stack of boxes, and there was a scattering of furniture that had been retired from usefulness. We swept our flashlights over piles and behind crates. No person, no raccoon, no explanation. When I passed a shadow in the corner, I found an old wooden rocker, a high-backed chair with spindles and the pale crescent from 100 small cushions. It looked like something that belonged in a parlor, not a storage room. For a stupid second, I sat in it to be funny, leaned back, and let it sway. The wood sighed with the exact sound that had drawn us downstairs. I stood up and the chair kept moving. At first it rocked just a fraction, as if the house exhaled. Then it swung more deliberately, steady and slow, as if someone invisible were easing into it. The air felt colder near the chair, like the light had been pulled from that corner. Zane and I froze. Marco had peeled himself off the couch and was pale as a sheet. Neither of us spoke. The chair kept its slow rhythm, creaking on its own. We did what terrified people do when they have to choose between sense and adrenaline. We ran. Up the stairs felt like springing through syrup. Every thud of our sneakers sounded obscene in the quiet. At the top, we slammed the stair door and wedged a heavy armchair under the knob, like a makeshift barricade. Hands shaking, we propped a table in front of it and backed away. Sleep evaporated after that. We argued about rational causes, an uneven floor, drafts, the house shifting, and each explanation felt thinner than the last. Zane swore the rocker had belonged to his grandmother, kept down there for memory's sake. He hadn't meant for anyone to use it. It was sentimental and dusty and carried stories he wouldn't bother to tell strangers. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, watching each shadow like a jury. When the sun finally hit the windows, the house looked like any other house, ordinary, tired, hungover. Still, none of us touched the basement door. Zane left it bolted until his parents came home days later. And even then we went downstairs together and turned the lights on in a small, brittle group. To this day, I don't have a clean answer. Maybe a breeze found a way. Maybe the floor shifted under old joints. Maybe the drunk guys made the chair move by accident and then remembered it as supernatural. All of those felt inadequate the way a single, precise scratch makes you certain a thing with intent passed nearby. I haven't been down into that basement alone since. One, avoid old rockers and thrift stores and keep an odd respect for the way simple objects can seem charged with memory. The mystery of that night, it's like a pebble in my shoe, small, persistent, impossible to completely ignore. The end. I told myself it would be easy money. One overnight, sit with Mrs. Ellery, make sure she took her meds, keep the TV low, call her daughter if anything odd happened. The agency was desperate, and Tess, her daughter, sounded tired on the phone when she described the arrangement. She wanders. Well, she's not dangerous. She just gets confused at night sometimes. You'd mostly keep her company. I needed the paycheck, and I've been doing this work for 5 years. It was the kind of job my hands remembered before my head did. The house sat back from the road behind a hedgerow of older maples. Inside smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and boiled cabbage, like someplace that had been lived in for decades and was now learning to be quiet. Eleanor Small stooped. All angles in a floral nightgown gripped my hand like it tethered her to the present. Tess left a post-it on the fridge with the usual meds, 9 p.m. to a.m. if up, 7 a.m., call me, or 911. She kissed her mother on the forehead, said, be nice to her, and closed the door. At first, it was exactly the odd, sad normal I expected. Mrs. Ellery watched reruns on a loop, misnamed the presidents, and asked, with the sincere curiosity of someone who wakes every morning in a slightly different life, where her husband was. I made tea, straightened the throw pillows, and read the box of cereal labels like a professional distraction. When she paced the hallway and opened the linen closet for no reason, I guided her back to bed and humored her with small confessions about your husband or the church choir, things she accepted like the blank page of a dream. There were little unsettled things easy to dismiss. A single scarf I'd hung over the stair rail would be on the back of the living room chair. The next morning, her glass of water appeared in the microwave with the handle pointed the other way. Once I found her slippers lined up on the front step, toes facing out, as though someone had gently set them to watch for company. Each incident felt like a private note someone had left for themselves. At about midnight, the house folded around me in the familiar way older houses do. Pipes sang. The radiator sighed. The refrigerator clicked like a clock. I dozed in the recliner while the TV muttered, trusting the small habit of the world to keep the edges predictable. Sometime near 2, I woke to a soft scraping sound above me, like someone dragging a foot along a hardwood floor. I sat up, the TV's glow painting the ceiling, and listened. It repeated, slow and careful. From the attic hatch, a footstep, then a pause, then another. Not the skitter of mice, not the thump of a branch. Human steps measured against wood. Eleanor, I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer. I told myself she'd gone to the bathroom or circled the hallway, and I let the thought settle back into the cushion. When the scraping came again, it moved lower toward the bedroom wing, the soft friction of something against the baseboard. I cinched my blanket and waited, part training, part of hope that waking was only a false alarm. I should have walked down the hall then. I didn't. Let me be honest. I was tired in a way that made practical choices slippery. 5 years in, you learn how to ration adrenaline and tell yourself you'll intervene when the world is plainly on fire. This was not on fire. This was only odd. The next sound was a slow, patient sniffing right outside the spare room where Tess had told me I could rest if needed. The closet door was cracked, cool blue light seeping from the hallway under it. My chest did the small concert of panic. I got up. My feet hit the rug, and I realized my hands were braced for a normal task. Lights on, voice soft. The practice recalibration of a person who has been asked to cradle another's confusion. Back into sleep. I stepped to the door, put my hand on the knob, and because inertia is human, I thought the rational thought, this will be fine. The closet door pushed open. Eleanor stood in the narrow seam of doorway, face pale, hair disheveled like birds had nested in it. But she wasn't moving like someone asleep. She moved with a pointed, steady intent I hadn't seen in her daytime confusion. In her hand she held an old wooden cane, the kind with a brass knob that had been polished thin from years of use. She lifted it slowly, not like a weapon, but like an instrument she knew how to use. My throat closed. Mrs. Ellery Eleanor, hi. Are you looking for something? I kept the word small and even, trying to purchase space between her and the things I wanted to keep. She blinked, and for a moment the earlier fog returned, and she smiled like the problem had been remembered and solved. They took the pictures, she said, voice thin. They took the pictures and left the frames. Someone needs them back. I stepped forward, hands open. We'll look for them. We'll find them, okay? Do you remember where? She didn't listen. She passed me, the cane tapping the rug, and moved toward the hallway where Tessa's bedroom was. Not toward the living room, not toward the kitchen where the safe place for misplaced things usually is. The hallway light made her shadow long. Her steps were small and decisive. Eleanor, slow, please, I said, because the way she moved felt rehearsed, like something remembered and executed without permission. She stopped at the head of the hallway and turned. There was a slant of something in her eyes that made me recoil, the sudden, dreadful sense that she was performing a role for someone else's amusement or experiment. Tessa's door was cracked. The lamp inside glowed like a wet coin. I stepped in front of the door to block whatever aim had brought her, the cane tucked under her arm like a sentinel. She lifted it and struck the door once, then twice, the sound hollow and final. Go away, she said with a voice that wasn't old and frail, but flat and practiced. They said no pictures. You go. It was then, absurdly, that Tessa's ringtone, the one she used for emergencies, started to buzz from the kitchen. I reached for my phone and lit with a text. On my way, heading back, 10 men. Hope is a sharp thing. I told Eleanor, Tessa's coming back in 10 minutes. Let's sit down and wait. I meant the words, and I hoped they would be the tide that pulled us both back to shore. For a second she softened, her jaw loosened like a hinge catching oil. Then she turned and walked toward the back door. My mouth went dry. The cane thudded against the wood floor as she passed me, and she opened the door without fumbling with the latch. The night blew in damp air, and the yard beyond was a black valley of the maples, the lawn stepping down to a thin line of river. I stepped after her like a person following a list. I should have called Tess. I should have dialed 911. I should have done any of the 1,000 obvious things. Instead, I followed because I couldn't explain my own feet. Outside under the porch light, Eleanor stopped at the old bird bath. On the lip someone had placed a neatly folded Polaroid, corners hard with age. I recognized the handwriting on the back at once. Tessa scrawled from the fridge note, but the photo looked wrong in the gray, a blur of motion where a face should be. An edge of a backyard tree, a shadow at the dock. Someone had taken the chair we kept on the lawn and set it facing the river, exactly 20 feet from the back door. Eleanor bent and picked up the photo with both hands like it might explain her world. She looked up at me, and something in her face was raw. Keepers, she said. The keepers of things, Eleanor, I said, voice small. Let's find Tessa's pictures inside. Let's come in. I touched her arm and she flinched like someone had touched the wrong page. That was the moment she raised the cane, not in violence as much as in authority, and tapped it once against the chair seat. The sound was sharp, like punctuation. A beat later, a second figure stepped from behind the crabapple tree, a man's shape, hoodie up, hands in his pockets, face shaded. The porch light made his profile a clean cut. I felt every bone in my body go empty. The man lifted his chin at Eleanor as if they were in on a private joke. He did not move toward us. He only stood watching, a spectator at a small, cruel performance. Tess pulled into the drive, headlights carving a white tunnel through the maples. She ran to the porch, breathless and furious and apologetic, words and questions leaping out at once. The man melted backward into the trees like smoke. Eleanor dropped the photo and did not look at anyone for a long moment. Tess put her hands on her mother's shoulders and murmured, "Mom, we're going inside. Okay, we're safe. When the three of us went back inside, Tess swore at me in a way that was kindness and fear wrapped together, then called the agency, then the police. The officers took a report, walked the yard with flashlights. The man had gone. There were no footprints in the soft earth beyond our own. They found no vehicle. Tess hugged her mother and asked her, quietly and fiercely, about the photos. Eleanor named the neighbor's dog, the pew at church, the number of her birth month. But when Tess asked who'd been placing things at the edge of the trees, Eleanor only said, "They come when the dark is soft and they move our things so we'll find them beautiful." I let the agency know I wouldn't take another shift at that house. Tess offered to pay me the extra, said I did the right thing. I left with my pockets empty and my hands full of a small Polaroid Tess insisted I keep, smudged and gray with water spots. On it, the back of a chair faces a river and a shadow at the edge of the frame looks like a person looking in. I still wake sometimes with the taste of river air in my mouth and the sound of soft footsteps on wood overhead. I'd have worked many nights since because the bills don't stop and people still need watching. And I have learned to listen for certain things, a practice cadence and a voice, the specific nervousness of someone who's cataloging another person's life. What haunts me is not the man who stepped from the trees or the photos he left like breadcrumbs. It's how easy it all felt to watch someone's quiet night and decide to rearrange it. The polite cruelty of small gestures that prove you were noticed. I never went back to that house. The agency moved her case to someone else. Tess called sometimes to say her mother had good days, and I would breathe and tell her to hold on to the photos she liked. But in the worst hours, when a neighbor hums a tune under a street lamp or when the closet door is ajar in a dim room, I remember the way Eleanor used a cane not as a shield, but as a signature, tapping punctuation into a life she thought she owned. The end.